alive! It's alive! It's alive! It's alive!
Hello and welcome to Alive After Reading. I'm Tim Niederreiter, and with me today is a guest who is, should have been here sooner, let's just say. Liz Butcher, welcome back to the podcast. Welcome to the podcast for the first time. Gosh, I screwed up immediately.
Thanks for having me.
Oh, you're very welcome. And introduce yourself to the audience a little bit.
Yeah, so Liz Butcher, I'm an Australian author and I write horror and dark fantasy.
Cool, Australia. Yeah, I've only been to Australia a few times, and that was many years ago now. So,
Awesome.
It's a nice country, though. At least it was at the time.
It still is.
I imagine it hasn't changed that much. Yeah.
No, probably not.
Yeah, I imagine I've changed more than that country has. I was a kid when I was last in Australia, but there you go.
Oh wow, yeah.
Yeah. So what books do you have any? Do you write mostly books, novels, or short stories? First of all,
Novels now. I did start off writing short stories for a couple of years just to sort of hone my craft a little bit. But now I focus primarily on novels.
Cool. Yeah. So what's your latest title you have out?
Yeah, so my latest one is LaRue Manor, that released earlier this month, which is a young adult horror that I'm super proud of. So that's been really exciting.
Cool. So could you tell us a little bit about that book?
Yeah, so it's about a young girl called Camille who lives here in Australia and is forced to move all the way over to the UK just before her senior year of high school, when her father inherits the family estate from his estranged uncle. But the minute she gets there, she's really drawn to the place. She just feels that she wants to get to know a little bit about her history, because up until this point she's had no idea about her family beyond her parents. And she discovers some old photo albums and things in the attic, including an article on the person who built the manor, her ancestor, who was murdered the day of its opening, and his 5-year-old daughter went missing the same day and was never seen again. So she kind of embarks on this journey of trying to work out what happened, but all the while all these strange things are happening to her and around the house that escalate the more she uncovers about the story.
Cool. So there's got a little bit of a mystery element to the horror side of things too.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that sounds really neat. So you say you also write dark fantasy though? So I write fantasy, so I guess I'm gravitating toward that mentally already. I'm thinking, what's the difference between horror and dark fantasy? Honestly, because there's a lot of crossover between those two genres.
Yeah, huge crossover. I think for me, horror, you've got your scare factor, you sort of chills in the back of the neck type scenarios, whereas what I consider to be dark fantasy is to have that sort of magical realism, that sort of side of things. It's still dark. It's not, nice fairies and things like that, but it doesn't necessarily have the horror scare factor that the horror side of things has, but still quite, I guess, a little bit more confronting and deep-seated type fantasy. That's kind of how I differentiate. I don't know if that's the same for everybody who says they write dark fantasy, but that's kind of how I separate the two.
Yeah, no, that's cool. It's funny because when I put my books into categories on Amazon, I frequently use dark fantasy because I feel like it kind of fits. But when I think dark fantasy, I think more like, I don't know, Joe Abercrombie or George R.R. Martin, I mean, that's kind of where my head goes, but it can go either way, obviously. I mean, there's a lot of range there.
I actually really struggle with categorizing my work because I just find there's no black and white, I guess, definition of, especially fantasy genres. So it can be really hard to know exactly where to slot your work in. But yeah, and I guess because different people, like you said, you consider those authors to be dark fantasy, and they wouldn't have necessarily been authors that came to my mind when I think of dark fantasy. So, yeah, I think it's really tricky.
It's a pretty wide genre if you think about it, I mean, or even subgenre, because I definitely think there's people like people writing books like I don't know people. Well, we'll go back to one of my first guests ever on this podcast, Con Lavery. Jeez, I always forget how to say his last name. But he's Canadian, but he writes, and some of his books are definitely more what I would consider one kind of dark fantasy, and some is more the others. The more more the definition you gave here, which is like so he does a bit of both and or combines them. I mean, So I was thinking about. Let me see. There's a good variety though of authors out there who do a mix of both, or there's the fantasy side where you can have a horror element in an already kind of bleak, secondary world story. That's where the two kind of cross over or become the same thing.
And I guess that it's never boring though, because you never really know what you're going to get when you pick up a dark fantasy book, because it could be anything. So I think that's kind of a cool element to it. For
sure, the variety is really cool. I mean, I sometimes I feel a little goofy saying like, "Oh, my fantasy is kind of dark." Well, it's not really that dark, at least not on the outset. It feels more like just kind of a normal a traditional fantasy story in some ways. But then there's this darker element kind of lurking in a lot of in the stories, at least I've been releasing lately. Yeah. Anyway, that's enough about me. So Liz, you've got this kind of almost duality between the horror and the dark fantasy, whereas one's more obviously the chills, like you said, the chilling feeling of horror versus kind of this is just kind of, I mean, honestly, almost, what do you say, weird? Is that kind of how you'd approach? How Lovecraft, not to throw names of old fogies around, but like Lovecraft is like his fiction was categorized as the weird at times. He was in that genre back then.
Yeah. I guess so. I guess when I say dark fantasy, as applying it to my writing, I guess I'm looking at it's not realistic in, I guess, real world sense. So, for example, with my previous book, Fate's Fury, that was kind of a mishmash of like mythology, dark fantasy, in that it was set in the real world, but obviously with magical realism, things like that, it's not going to happen in real life. So I guess that's where I tag fantasy element, but I have the dark part because I always have bad things happen. So there's always not light, happy, fantasy. I'm not going to promise happy endings pretty much ever. So I guess for me, that's why I say dark fantasy. And when people ask what I write and say horror and dark fantasy, when you kind of put horror first, people have already got that in the back of their heads before you say dark fantasy. That I tend to write on the heavier side of things. So I guess there's that expectation, but I guess that's kind of how I define it.
No, that's really cool. Actually, I love the idea of magical realism, and I've enjoyed the magical realism that I've read as well. And you identify that as being close. That's That's almost like dark magical realism is almost what you're saying here. There's this kind of there's stuff here that couldn't happen, but it's not necessarily a werewolf. It's not urban fantasy or paranormal like that.
Yeah, exactly. Great, we just created another genre. Dark magical realism. just a confusing.
Genre's a confusing thing in the first place.
Yeah, exactly.
Sure can be. That's why I think categorization is. I mean, at the end of the day, a little bit of a vain attempt to make the world simpler, right? For people, for readers and writers. But in the end, it can be helpful.
That's why I like. Yeah, it's good to happen. That's kind of where I like to sort of situate. So I don't create, completely fantastical landscapes or anything like that. I actually, I guess, main fantasy with world building and massive family trees and all that kind of stuff. All my stuff's set in the modern world, but I just
Okay.
have, strange things happen to people. So that wouldn't really happen, I would hope.
Yeah, we could always hope that the strangest kind of things aren't going to happen. The strangest, worst things aren't going to happen to people. It's this. It is this kind of interesting thing because that I generally write set in those fantastic landscapes. So that's the big difference, I suppose.
Yeah.
And actually, my books have less horrible things happen to people. At least I like to think they do. But people who read my books don't always seem to agree with me about that. I feel like maybe books are pretty normal. They're not really scary, but some people they've disagreed with me. We just put it that way.
But even that, I mean, what scares one person doesn't necessarily scare someone else. So even horror's not black and white.
Mm-hmm.
One person can read something and be like, "Oh, that didn't scare me in the slightest," and the other person can, want to sleep with their light on for a week. So, you can never really predict, I guess, what will affect one reader or the other.
Right. Yeah. And there's some people are going to have a visceral reaction to certain scenes or moments, and other people are just going to be like, "This is okay. It's Tuesday or whatever," or that was bad, but it wasn't as freaky to them as it was to the person who has the more extreme reaction. Yeah.
And that's one thing I sort of struggled with writing LaRue Manor, was because it is primarily horror. It's probably the first novel I've written that's been more based in horror than anything else. And writing it, I was really concerned that, is this just going to be cheesy? Is this predictable? Like everything you don't want when writing a horror story. And I was really sort of just mindful of it. And at the time, Catherine Hudson was editing it for me. And I sort of said to her, "This is what I'm really worried about." And twice she messaged me and she's like, "Dude, I had to put it down and walk away." So I was like, yes, that's exactly what I wanted. So that sort of confirms me that, it wasn't what I was fearing, that it'd be just cheesy and predictable B-grade horror. So, but then again, the things that freaked her out about it might not freak out someone who reads a lot more horror. So again, you just don't know.
Yeah. Yeah, and there's this, and you get jaded to your own work. It's eventually, I'd imagine. I mean, I definitely have. I mean, the emotions you feel, because at least allow me to say that I think writing involves a lot of imparting emotions to the reader. Right? You're putting emotions into the book, feelings that you want the reader to feel in a way.
Yeah.
And I don't think that's a controversial thing to say. But on the other hand, as a writer, the more times you write a scene or a story like this, that's why changing pace is so powerful. Because the more you write a story that's supposed to be scary or inspiring or whatever your story is supposed to be, the more it's like it takes more. It gets old for the writer. I think it does anyway. At least it risks it. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's where, I guess, really getting into your character's head pays off, because it keeps it fresh for you as a writer.
Mm-hmm.
But also I think it helps you steer away from feeling like you're just writing repetitive scare scenes, because horror's got its tropes and the usual things that you sort of expect to happen, but without that emotive side of the character, the reactions, that's what I feel really adds to a horror scene. And like you said, you do put emotion into your writing, and that applies for horror as well. It doesn't mean that you're experiencing it for yourself,
Mm-hmm.
but I think it's really important to really place yourself in the character and think, how would they be reacting and feeling at this particular time, because their anticipation and their fear is what makes it more scary.
Yeah.
If they just observe something and kind of go, "Oh, wow, that just happened," and that's it, I mean, that's not scary. And people are going to be like, "What?" But if you've got that anticipation and that build-up of their fear and their emotions and their heightened awareness and they're freaking out, and you can pull the reader into that, then it's already scary before the incident actually happens. So I think emotions play a huge part in writing it.
That's a really good point, because because it's not necessarily the writer's emotions that you need to be tapped. I mean, you tap into your emotions to write the character's emotions, but that's mostly from experience. That's just your experience you're using to write how this character acts in that situation or reacts in that situation. It's a really
exactly.
Yeah. it's gonna be helpful for me because honestly, I have forgotten that kind of trick. I realized, or I never really thought about it that way. I never thought in terms of like, oh yeah, it's not me who is in this book. I'm not I don't try to self-insert myself into my books, but like, I guess I've been doing that to some degree, at least with the writing process.
I think we all do subconsciously. Like I've often been asked, is this character based on yourself or on this person or that person? I automatically always go to say no, but then if I actually stop and think about it, I'm like, well, hang on, they do that, and I kind of do that. Like, I think subtle things creep in over time that you don't necessarily intend to put in there, but in hindsight, when you look back, you can see, I guess, your influence on how the characters sort of developed, which isn't a bad thing. But it can be a bit of an eye-opener as well. You're like, oh, wow, I didn't realise I could do that. You recognise it in the character that you don't recognise it in yourself. So, yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah, right. It's kind of like with that what is it? I think it's a Buddhist expression where it's like, you can learn things from, a wise person can learn from a fool or something like that. It's like, but also you can learn from anybody is really the gist of it.
Yeah.
But you can even learn from this character you created because it's exposing part of yourself kind of externally, which is interesting. Anyway.
Exactly. Yeah.
So you got this kind of very. I mean, I don't know. I'm just trying to think because this is one of those questions I feel like could be very cliche if I ask it wrong. But I'm like, what about it is that draws you to dark fiction? I guess.
Interesting question. I've actually always been quite obsessed with the darker side of the world, and even like I'm talking like a young kid, I'd be getting books out from the library about paranormal things and hauntings and all that kind of stuff. I've always been drawn to it, so it was just kind of a natural progression when I started writing my own stories that they would be dark, because I kind of find when the lines are blurred between what's real and what isn't, that's when things are the most interesting for me personally. So, yeah, and just a few experiences and stuff throughout my own growing up. I just feel that that's where I kind of sit naturally. I don't think I could really write anything else well. It's got to be that sort of dark and shadow type place.
Right. I mean, it's kind of like, I feel the same way about writing fantasy and science fiction, or especially fantasy, though. Because when I think about a story, I think about the creatures and I think about the places that aren't real and that kind of thing, And that's immediately the part that jumps out to me. So it makes sense that you've just got a different aptitude, a different kind of orientation toward the stories.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
I've always found it interesting where, people say, "Oh, write what you know," and then you're kind of like, well, that's a little messed up if people take that literally and look at what I write. And it's, wow, this is really bad. It's like, as a horror writer, I don't think you're writing what you know literally, but it's just kind of interesting. I've always wondered, especially as fantasy writers as well, where they do create worlds and creatures and everything like that. Does that saying apply, and how does it apply? But I think we do take elements of our experiences and I guess kind of manipulate them to fit into the genres that we're writing.
Absolutely. I mean, for example, this fantasy setting I'm writing now, I was very inspired by, I guess, Catholic teachings that I learned when I was a kid, because I was raised Catholic. And even though it's not specifically, it's not really, there's no Catholic church, obviously, in the setting because it's a secondary world, but there's a certain amount of flavor that comes from thinking about things in those terms. So I think it's more like write what you understand, not write what you know. Write the things you can infer. Yeah.
That'd be probably a better way to say it, I think.
So as far as writing what you understand, do you think there's a kernel to the dark, to the just this dark side that you a reason you understand it? If you don't mind talking about that,
I don't even know. Probably wouldn't understand.
Understand might even be the wrong word. Yeah.
Yeah, because I guess one of the appeals of
Or you're
anything to do
drawn
with
to it, maybe. Yeah.
paranormal, is that we don't understand it, but it's intriguing. And I think for me, I'm a highly curious person, so I'm actually more drawn to things where I don't know the answer, or the answer isn't easily sort of obtained. And I sort of had some experiences when I was quite young, and then again in my teens, that were quite scary to me. I still don't even really know what they were about, but I guess it sort of embedded that seed in my brain that sort of pursuing those areas that are just completely grey. There's no black and white, and open to interpretation, which is perfect for someone with an overactive imagination, because there's no one to say that's not right or that's wrong, because everything's just open to theories. So I guess that's why I've always been drawn to sort of the darker side of writing. And it's also, I guess, I love that part of the human psyche, in that I think everyone's sort of got that sort of shadowy place in the back of their mind that you can kind of tap into. And I think when you combine someone's psyche with a scary environment, you can create a really heightened, I guess, scenario to be fearful and scary. And if you're making people question not just what they're reading, but maybe their own experiences, I think that's a really kind of cool and creepy thing to do.
No,
freaking them out completely.
What was that? Sorry.
I said without freaking them out completely.
Oh yeah, you don't want to freak them out. Well, maybe you do want to freak them out completely. Though.
Maybe a little bit.
if your goal is to get them to put the book down, I think that'd be part of it, right?
Yeah.
His goal is to make put the book down. It's like, I need a break from this. This is crazy.
Yeah.
Which actually, that happens to me a fair amount with movies, occasionally with books, actually. There were a few books that happened to me where I'm like, I feel, because I have a visceral response to certain kinds of gore in film or in fiction, even, which is weird, because I know a lot of people are like, it's just too gross when you're looking at an image or a scene of something horrifyingly bloody or something. But even if I read something that just triggers the wrong part of my brain, I could like almost pass out. It's pretty serious.
Wow. So I don't mean to laugh.
No, it's fine.
That's an intense reaction.
It's just imagination, really, I think. Because I just can't... Because like even when I'm reading I think it was this Orson Scott Card book, Heart's Hope, that I read. I was reading it on a Sunday morning. I remember this pretty distinctly. I got to this one scene, and I read this scene, and I was back in college, and I just collapsed on my bed. It was kind of crazy, because I was like, I just couldn't put it away, and then I couldn't stop thinking about it, And I just lay there for a while. But
unraveled.
Yeah, it's pretty scary. But it's a scary thing to happen, but then it becomes like, oh, I just need to steer clear of that stuff because my brain is just not going to deal with it, Yeah,
you don't do it a second time. You've got your warning. Don't do it again.
Right, and usually the other thing is it only works that when I don't expect it. So like if I read the same thing again, it's not going to be have the same effect. It's not.
That's
it's not.
True.
Yeah, it's like the first time it's an unexploded landmine, and the second time it's just an empty casing.
Yeah. Yeah,
but,
that's exactly right. Yeah. I think that's kind of where books can be more potent than movies, at least with sort of the horror and dark fantasy side of things, because at least when you're watching a movie, it's all there for you, and it'll still be scary, but there's no room for you to have to interpretate or read between the lines or anything like that. Your imagination's almost kind of just switched off. It's just watching and absorbing, whereas when you're reading a book, that's scary, and especially if you've got a really overactive imagination, it can take you places the writer might not have even considered. So it's almost like your imagination is what's doing all the work as you're reading it, and you could just create some really quite horrific imagery in your mind just based off the words when you don't have something to visually do it for you.
Right.
If that makes sense.
Yes, exactly. And I think that's I've sometimes had that kind of experience with just my imagination, which is really not good. But I could just like, oh, I'm thinking about the wrong stuff. I'm out of here. You better. It's like a blue screen of death, but it's like it happens to me when I'm trying to think about something too gross, basically.
Yeah.
Very strange.
Triggers.
But
at least you know when it starts, and so you can kind of just think about something else.
Exactly.
Quickly.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's probably enough about my personal hang-ups about blood and gore. But yeah, I think it's really interesting though, because that's one of the things that keeps me from ever writing horror. Basically, I mean, I can't write straight up horror because I'm not all horror is gory, but it's the same kind of principle. Keeps me from writing something that's truly chilling or terrifying in that way.
Yeah, see, I don't think any of my works really got, like, some of my novels really have any gore in them. I sort of prefer that suspenseful type horror rather than straight up. I mean, don't get me wrong, there's a time and place for gore, but it's just kind of not my thing per se. Yeah, I'd rather have that sort of build up of anticipation and more of a psychological scare. Like you said, with the imagination, you're sort of drawing these things out of people's minds as they're reading. To me, that I find that more scary, because I guess people question their own minds then. They're imagining this stuff up as they're reading. So I find that more scary than sort of, like your slasher type horror.
Yeah, for lack of a better word, you want to trigger a response in them, in the reader.
Yeah, exactly. Rather than, with a lot of the gore type horror, you know exactly who's causing it and that they're coming, or, that type of storyline. Whereas psychological type horror, you don't know what's going to happen or where necessarily it's coming from. Is it me, or is it something external, or is it both, or is it one feeding off the other? And that's what I really like about it. It's that questioning of just not necessarily knowing the origin and who or what is responsible. And I think one of the scariest things is acknowledging that it's your own mind is what the issue is, because you can't always walk away from that or turn it off.
Yeah.
Age, or so for me that's far scarier.
Yeah, the fact that you can't get away from the thing in your head is pretty freaky.
Yeah,
exactly. If you think about it.
It is, yeah. You can't just run upstairs and lock the door or anything like that, because it's always going to just be following you. So I find that, far more intense.
That is certainly a frightening thought. That's for sure. The thing that you can't escape. That, I mean, it's like that. I think that it's like that kind of the horror that has to do. I mean, I've heard of this. I've never really read or seen a lot of movies with it. Or I mean, I definitely know this exists. But it's just the feminine horror, or the horror of pregnancy is what I think I've heard specifically. Which is just I'm not saying you're right. That what I'm saying is that's the kind of like a more overt version of that, where it's like, there's this other creature that's living inside me right now. Oh, that's freaky. In a way, if you look at it, if you look at a certain direction, it can be. Yeah. Yeah,
it could absolutely be quite dark and scary. Yeah, that's actually kind of really cool. I would never have considered that before. But yeah, when you put it like that, that's quite creepy.
But of course, if it's you're the monster in a way. You're the creature. That's the one where it's in your head. Yeah. You have the creature inside.
That's kind of cool, actually.
Yeah. Well, go on. Sorry.
No, I just that'd be a good idea to write something along those lines, I think.
Yeah, bouncing ideas around. That's what writers do, I suppose. It's like
that's it.
Anyway, could you? We are running out of time though, so let the listeners know where they can find your work and what titles they should look for.
Sure. So they can find everything on my website, which is lizbutcher.com.au, or they can find me on Facebook and Twitter and on Amazon. So my latest release is LaRue Manor, and last year I also released Fate's Fury. So check them out and let me know what you think.
Great. Thanks for being on the show, Liz. It's been a lot of fun.
Thanks for having me, Tim.
So as for this podcast, you can find more of us at mentalcellarpublications.com, and there you can also find my new podcast, which is Recorded Writer Walking, just because I'm not great at titles, but the RWW podcast, which is all about, it's just me walking outside and on my walks, and I record an episode, and it usually drops each day. I've done 3 of them so far, but there will be another one out. There'll be more out by the time this podcast drops. So, yeah, definitely check those out. And, of course, Shadow Prince is out now. So if you like Demon Scroll, go read Shadow Prince. Go give it a read through if you're in Kindle Unlimited, especially. Either way. Buying it's great too, folks. So, yeah, that book's out now. And there'll be more books coming soon. So thanks for listening, everybody. And have a good week.
That tears it.